Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Grief Festival's launch of Julia Samuel's brilliant new book, Every Family Has a Story, How We Inherit Love and Loss. I'm Liesl Dawson, and I think many of you know Julia Samuel, who is one of the UK's leading psychotherapists and the best-selling author of two other books, Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass. Julia's work has always emphasized how love and connection is vital to our well-being, how we need to adjust to change if we are to grow and adapt, and how trauma and unresolved grief have a lasting impact. But her new book is the first time we get to see these insights played out across generations of families. Through 8 gripping case studies, she explores a range of common issues, from divorce, step relationships, and adoption, to bereavement, addiction, and suicide. Julia tells us that change is a collective business, and it is only by feeling the pain of the past that families transform and grow. It's a wonderful book, and I can recommend it to everyone. Before I launch into some questions and discussion, I just want to remind you about the structure and practicalities. So this session is being recorded and will be available afterward on the Good Grief channel. And as usual, we're going to talk for about 30 minutes, Julie and I, and then we will turn to questions from the audience. So feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And also feel free to, talk in the chat, and also to respond to one another's questions. So welcome, Julia. It's absolutely a delight to have you here.
Well, thank you for such a lovely introduction. And it's so nice to be back on the Good Grief channel. And I recognize a lot of those names, and I feel like we're a community that know each other. So it feels a really special place to launch my book, and a very safe place to be asked questions, because it's always quite nerve-wracking launching a book, because it's very personal what I do. So I'm excited rather than terrified to be speaking to you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's questions too.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, I want to start really by asking you about the origin of this book. What prompted you to write it, and why did you turn your attention to families?
For the last kind of 32 years, anyone that has walked through my door, whatever their presenting issue, they have spent great tracts of time focusing on their family of origin and their family that they're making, trying to understand what it is that makes them, what's their identity, what are their issues, where does that come from, wanting to understand themselves and wanting to kind of be them best selves, both in their family of origin and in the family that they're making. And often you really need to kind of look at where you've come from to know who you are. And, in my therapy, I spent great tracts of time looking at my family too. And we know that love matters and families matter. We need them in crisis. We need them to celebrate the good things, and we need them for everyday life. The sort of stability of a family where the good intention is for each other, kind of not against each other. And in the last 2 years, I think for all of us, family, it's been kind of magnified how important family is.
That's fabulous. No, so interesting. And I think one thing about your book is I don't think we always see this many people in therapy. I think it's one of the things that makes the case studies feel at times like short stories, because what you get are lots of characters, a sense of the deep past and how that is presenting in current problems and tensions and sort of secrets kind of coming out. But I guess lockdown in some ways facilitated that, because on Zoom, you can get so many more people in a kind of space than you could in person.
I mean, Zoom facilitated me seeing these families. So I wanted I kind of know from the research, but also from my experience professionally and personally, that the theory is that the stress or the suffering or the pain from one generation, if it is not dealt with in that generation, it gets passed down to the next generation until someone's prepared to feel the pain. And it gets passed down from behaviors, from the defenses that we use to block the pain, which have come in, millions of ways. But also it comes down, the research of Rachel Yehuda and many others, epigenetically, that your genetics, your heightened levels of cortisol get passed down for 3 generations. And so it's kind of a collision of both. And I don't think we've ever looked at the impact of the past on us enough. And so one of the questions that led me to write the book was, rather than saying to yourself, what is wrong with me? Why am I so difficult, sensitive, complicated? My better question is look up and look and see the untold stories, the unvoiced stresses, the shames, the shame, the secrets of previous generations, and see how they can be influencing and even contaminating your life now. That we can be sort of thinking that we're in blissful ignorance by not looking at it, but actually that ignorance is what can be contaminating and limiting our present because it hasn't been dealt with.
Absolutely. And I think you make it clear in the book that often one feels a psychological wound, but it doesn't start with the person who's experiencing it, and that actually they need to find out what's happened before in order to understand what they're feeling physically and emotionally. They're anxious, but where does that anxiety come from? You said a little bit about how,
isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. You said a little bit about how trauma is inherited. You kind of started on that. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more. So some of it you said is the kind of patterns and the events kind of coming through, our upbringing. You also mentioned epigenetics. Do you want to say a bit more about how that works?
So grief is naturally adaptive. So grief is a process of pain that comes through our system like weather. And as we feel the hit of the pain, we incrementally adjust to this new reality that we didn't want and we didn't choose. And it changes us, it changes our relationship with ourselves and the person that's died and our present and our future. But we accommodate it, we grow through it, and we don't want it, and it's very painful, but it is naturally adaptive. Trauma sits in the neural pathway of the brain that isn't adaptive. And so it stays on alert and puts you on code red in your body. It's kind of it's triggered by sight, sound, touch, and smell. So we block a lot of our thoughts or feelings with our thinking. Trauma bypasses our thinking. Trauma trumps logic. And it's like code red, the fire alarms go off in our brain when we hear, so say you've had an accident and you were in an ambulance. Every time you hear an ambulance, if you haven't processed the trauma, that ambulance will send off the alert of where you are. It takes you back in time to the moment the stressor happened. And so if you're the child of someone who has unresolved trauma, we learn as children by observing our adults, by observing their behaviors and how they respond to events and people and their own emotions. That's how we learn. And so if that's how you're brought up, you will have similar, maybe not so strong, but similar responses. Am I very dark? Do I need to turn the light on? Is it all right, the light?
I think you are okay, but you could always try a light if you.
Yeah,
it's getting darker. It's getting darker. So sometimes, yes, as things change. Let's see. That looks brighter.
Yeah, that's better. Sorry,
yes,
everyone.
that's better. No, that's good. That's a good call. The story in your book, the family in your book, for me, that this really speaks to is the Rossi family, which I found really gripping as a story. Could you say a little bit about the Rossi family?
So the Rossi family, there was a mother who was the widow of her husband, Italian husband, who had died. He killed himself 40 years before, and her 3 adult children. And what was so kind of powerful and agonizing was how the trauma was still playing out 40 years later in this family. And it hadn't been processed. And how the therapy came about was these 3 adult daughters, the eldest was in her 40s, the other one was sort of 38, 35. They said to their mum, you know, it's a very loving family. They really loved each other. That was very clear. But their mother, they felt, kind of got upset and was unpredictable and got angry at the least thing. And they wanted her to deal with it. And she was amazingly, you know, it's very difficult being kind of challenged by the people you love most in the world, and daring to come and meet a stranger, me, and hear your children say to you, Mum, you did this, and Mum, you did that. And it was very painful and very difficult. But the thing that was reparative, well, there were multiple things that were reparative. One of them was, she said to them in this very kind of moving moment, I never asked you what it was like for you. I couldn't dare ask. And I think all of us as parents know, when my children really suffer, there's a bit of me that wants to turn away, that can't look, that it's unbearable. You know, that window of tolerance, it goes very closed when the people you love most are really suffering. And they were able to tell her and each other, they had never talked about each other, what their experience of their father's actual death was, what the experience of the funeral was, what it meant to them afterwards. And they had developed all very direct behaviors that come from trauma, alcoholism, lots of behaviors that were sort of self-harming. And by being able to hear each other's stories, by engaging with their father, one of the things, because, you know, everyone watching, I imagine you're here because you're grieving someone. The person has died, but the love for them never dies. But they hadn't really been able to continue the love for him because it had been completely wiped out by the trauma. So we did this thing where they wrote a letter to him collectively. It was an incredibly moving letter. So they restored their relationship with their dad and had memories, you know, bursts of memories that they completely blocked. And they then went on to have EMDR, which is the best treatment, I think, for trauma, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, because I couldn't do that for all of them. And what it meant was the distress and the tightness in the relationship dropped many degrees, and the trust and the love and the humor that was there, that was so always there, but had been kind of blocked by this electricity, abounded. It was incredibly moving. What I also want to add is it doesn't mean it's a happy ever after. It's still a tragedy their dad died by suicide. They still will always find it difficult when they see other people with their fathers. You know, that will always be painful. But what we did was manage for them to be able to have a different relationship, so it wasn't interfering and blocking their capacity to engage and live their life in the present.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I found it so moving, and the way that they shared memories that they'd never shared before of his death and their childhood, and how the daughters all felt really so much relief from hearing this. And also, so it was interesting to see you work in a grief mode, but with a whole family, and also a family where continuing bonds had not, you know, the idea that they would continue their relationship with their father hadn't occurred to them. And it did seem to me that there was a shift there when they could start also picturing his whole life and not just his death. So I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful story. I loved it. Found it very moving. We've had a few,
Can I just add one thing to that? And I don't know if I wrote this in the book, but I should have done, is that when the circumstances of the death are very traumatic, often the death story overwhelms the life story. So that in the trauma of the death, you no longer have the relationship with the person that died, that gets lost. And I think what we managed with this was that we got the life story as well as the death story, with all of its imperfections. I mean, it wasn't suddenly, a hero.
No, absolutely. And somebody asked just in the chat, do you believe complex trauma over several generations can be healed if the person in the present really wants to resolve and understand it? And I know I said questions at the end, but that seemed particularly relevant here.
I mean, I definitely, I'm wary of saying like resolved, like something gets completely sorted. But I definitely think your relationship with yourself and your family and whatever the complex trauma is can shift and change and reduce that kind of high level of alert that pings in your system when you face it. And what's important is supporting yourself through it, being compassionate with yourself, kind to yourself, so that you don't turn on yourself when you're feeling the pain, because trauma you can really kind of knife yourself with your own trauma.
That's really interesting. Another question I have is about families, and of course, and some families, when they hit a crisis moment, they really pull together, they get closer, they're supportive. And some families, when they hit a crisis moment, completely fall apart. And is there any way of knowing, what's the difference? Or, why do some families explode and some, get closer, really?
I mean, I think there are very unique and individual answers. I think at the core is love, that there is love in abundance rather than scarcity. And love in all its different hues, love in moving forward, love in action, love in stepping back, love in trusting, love in connection, so that every member of the family, whatever they're suffering, they feel safe and known and seen and supported in this one place. And that allows you to weather so much distress, because you have this place you can go to where you can be all of yourselves, your furious, dramatic, hurt self, and still be loved. And that allows you then to allow the enormity of the event to come through your system. Families that are very armored, are very rigid, where there isn't the goodwill, where there's many more negative interactions than positive interactions, they don't have the capacity. They're already very fragile. They already have a lot of fault lines. So a storm coming through those families will pull them apart, because there isn't that abundance to weather it. Does that make sense? A bit like I'm talking about?
No, it makes perfect sense.
Recipe, but
yeah, and I think that makes sense, and also this sense that they can be adaptable to change. Kind of going back to some of your other principles, that when a crisis hits, there's good communication, they can pull together, and there's love. I think, that makes perfect sense. One thing I was really struck by in reading your book, it's called, Every Family Has a Story. But what I encountered often was families having multiple stories, many of which are in competition. And also some kinds of stories that are very repressive and kind of silencing, and other stories that feel more inclusive and, open. And I just wonder about the role that stories play in families and in therapy.
That's such a good question. So I think stories and narrative meaning making is who we are as human beings, how we understand ourselves. And I think often what isn't recognized within a family or within a friendship group or a partnership, that 5 people can be in the same room. And so you can agree on the date and the table and the room and the place, but your experience of what happens will be incredibly subjective, and your perception of it, the story you tell yourself of what happened in that afternoon or that evening will be very different, and it will be informed by your previous history, by your mood at the time, by your relationship with the people in the room. And often in kind of controlling families, that they don't allow multiple stories. It becomes very black and white, and it's like, I am right, and that means that you are wrong. So that you can compete, you know, about dad being this type of person, or dad loved me best, or, you know, I'm just using that as an example. But families that allow multiple perspectives, multiple views of them as a family are also much more robust. Because remember, the story you tell yourself individually and the story you tell yourself collectively as a family is the family you become. So if I am the person that is telling myself a very negative story, that is how I will see the world. And collectively as a family, if I recognize other people's perceptions are as valid as mine, although they may be very different, it doesn't deny me mine. And if I take that attitude out into the world, I'm much more likely to trust and be trusted, because I'm engaging in the world from a position of openness and willingness to listen and a willingness to allow. It doesn't mean that you don't have a view, because that is, you know, it's important that we have our perspective, but when you can be, you know, I think families, when they collaborate and cooperate with each other, that is a superpower. That is an unbelievable superpower that can overcome so much difficulty. And let's face it, everyone has difficult lives in many ways.
I think you say it perfectly. And my sense reading the book is that a lot of what you do is also allowing certain individual narratives to be heard and integrated. So I think family therapy is powerful also because sometimes you have a dynamic where only one person's narrative is allowed. And I think I found this with the Taylor and Swift family, and a family of a couple who's broken up and they have new partners and different children. And in some ways, the kind of kids' narratives weren't really listened to. And actually they had a lot to say. I wonder if you want to say anything about that case study, which I found really interesting.
Well, the image that comes up with the Taylors is if you have a particular route that you take, and that path, you know, like rabbits up a mountain, you get stuck down a path. And so in the Taylor Smith family, the mum and the dad had these clashing zigzag paths. And so whenever they saw each other, the old fights, all the laundry list of 10 years of conflict came up. And what was wonderful about their son, he was sort of 14, and he would come and he'd put his head down like this, and he'd be in his pajamas and he wouldn't really listen. And then he'd look up and say something unbelievably perceptive in about 2 sentences. And what emerged with them was, I mean, there was a lot of complexity and suffering that I won't go into, but one of the big difficulties in families that separate is loyalty binds. That for him, when he went into his dad's house, and if he had a relationship with his stepmother, he was in some way being disloyal to his mum. And when he was with his mum, he was in some way being disloyal to his dad. So he's torn between the two. So as a collective family, and we turned off the screen for him. So he was like in a sort of, you know, in Tavistock, they used to do this thing where the moderators would be behind a glass door and watch the family. So he was a bit like that. He'd listen to his parents, but not show his face. We worked out how they could expand their kind of communication and understanding of each other that didn't knock each other out, and allowed him to move more freely between the family members and also see his dad on his own. And you know, again, it's this idea of abundance. It wasn't like there was only this tiny cake, which often in separated families, the cake of time and money and attention is very small. It does get chopped up. They weren't in the same financial crisis they had been. And that actually, I think if they'd come to see me 5 years before, when they had a lot of financial difficulties, I probably wouldn't have been able to do the work. It's almost like they got to a place of safety. And Julie, the mum, had another partner, that she had the emotional capacity to weather the difficulty of facing the separation and what she needs to do to be different. I think in crisis, you can't really stand it. I mean, that may not be true for everyone, because nothing is always, but.
Yeah. Wendy has written in the chat that Terry Pratchett floated the idea that perhaps we are not Homo sapiens, but actually Père Narans, the storytelling ape. That storytelling is what defines us. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, moving toward a narrative that, and I thought Ashley's perspective was so crucial for them reconceptualizing the family and actually allowing that story to be integrated, completely changed the power dynamics.
Yeah.
And some of the surface problems were actually about deeper problems of feeling excluded or unloved or not part of the family.
Not being wanted.
And again, you did it in very subtle, small ways, and yet it hit these much deeper layers. So it was another one I found them all fascinating.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. You're my only fan. But the thing that I love about the book is it's often the voices of the outliers who turn out to be curative and the most powerful. So the grandmothers were incredibly powerful. The younger generation were incredibly powerful. In many of the stories, the young were the ones that had this kind of fresh perspective and good ideas, because they weren't stuck down that rabbit run, so they could see something with an expansive, more open view. And I think we underestimate the influence of the young on adults, but also that the grandmother can have on their adult children. I think often the frame that we get, that the grandparents are a kind of burden that we have to look after, or someone that you have to go and see for Sunday lunch or something, whereas the grandparents in these stories were very wise and powerful. They had so much influence on being able to get their children to do things that they wouldn't do without them.
It's almost time for us to go to questions, but before I do, I just want to ask, at the near the end of the book, you have really helpful 12 touchstones for family well-being. You sort of give a kind of toolkit of things we can look at, like being self-compassionate, having more open communication, learning to fight productively, power dynamics, and some sort of advice about how to strengthen our families and improve our relationships within them. And I just wonder if you want to, offer a couple of pointers about what we can do ourselves in our own families.
I mean, I think, so it isn't like a kind of list of you must do this, and you can adapt it to make it your own. But it's what I believe are the things that contribute to robust, resilient, kind of strong families. And the underpinning idea is that where you love most, you hate most, you make your biggest mistakes, and you kind of suffer most. And it's, indifference is the opposite of love, not hate. And so, but where you're with the people you love most, they also drive you nuts, and you're with them every day. And so there's the idea comes from that we will always have rupture where things go wrong. And the importance is to have ways that we can repair after the rupture. So a lot of those touchstones are like open communication, fighting productively, making habits, rituals, things that are power dynamics, that are not only one voice is heard, allowing difference. And all of that really are ways and attitudes and kind of values as a family that allow you to sort out the underbelly of family when all the stuff goes wrong, so that you don't split and become estranged, which happens in too many families.
Absolutely. I really like it. So I sat down with my family.
Did you?
To discuss it. And I think one thing that's nice is that it opens up conversations. And I think there are things that within the family that are happening, but actually having a kind of list to go through, it enables people to think a bit and actually to say, yes, we all know that this is a particular issue that we need to work on. Which is really
make it a board game, couldn't you?
Well, and it's like, I find it really interesting. And I asked my kids which ones we should work on, and they each had something about themselves, interestingly, which related to the other, so you see also how each of these things is embedded in something else, and how the power structure can either open or shut down conversation. And that can either allow difference or block difference within a family. So I think, it's a lovely way of getting families to be more self-conscious and to just give them a vocabulary of things that they see and feel but don't say.
And don't have a visualization of, like, all of these things that we've talked about are below the waterline, aren't they? Power, habits, all of that. I mean, that habit is physical, but the intention to make them and love and all of that you can't see. So it does give you a kind of pathway to be able to kind of voice them and talk about them. I love that you did that with your family.
It was fun. Well, I like your comment in the book that so much of what is spoken in families is trivial, and the crucial important things are often not talked about. And I think, again, the book allows a way in to having some of those conversations, not at a crisis point, but as part of your everyday interactions. We've had an absolute heap of questions come in. Great. Some in the chat, some on the, some over here, some that are quite long. I'm going to start because there's lots. The first one is about how to deal with the controlling father. My father is a very bullying and controlling man who always has to be right. Over the years, when I tried to tell him how his behavior impacts me, he flies into a defensive rage and becomes abusive. 2 years ago, I cut him out of my life, but recently my wife and I had our first child. My father is keen to reestablish contact, but I worry about letting him back in my life. Since I've cut off contact, I've become calmer, happier, and less anxious. Even getting a text from him makes me feel sick and makes my eczema flare up. Oh, goodness. What do you suggest I do?
I mean, that is a very big question that is probably too hard to answer in a few moments. But certainly if her body is remembering and her body is holding the score, it sounds like she holds a lot of trauma from the bullying and the flying off the handle and his, over-controlling behavior. And, that sounds extreme. So before you kind of rebuild contact, I would suggest that you get some therapy. So you begin to get the distress out of your body. And then, I mean, I don't know if this is possible with your dad because he might not be up for it, but I would try and negotiate a deal with him that you see him, and the deal is, I don't know what kind of boundaries you want to put in, but if you can think of the thing that he does that is most distressing, if you can name that as a boundary with him, so you can hold two things. I really love you and I want you to be a present granddad in my child's life. And also, I find it very difficult when you, whatever it is, can we kind of do a deal that when I come, you don't do this, and then we can have more of a loving. Whether that's possible with him, I don't know, but certainly I would deal with a lot of your distress in your body and the trauma that's stuck in your neural pathways before you build your bridges, because whatever he does at the moment, he's triggering you, isn't he? If you get your eczema, feel anxious just by a text.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Here's a question I can answer. will the book be available as an audiobook? I
It
can answer
is.
this. I can answer that because as well as having the physical book, I also listened to the book today on audiobook, which is narrated by the wonderful Julia. So yes, it's on Audible. Get it today. That was an easy one. I could do that easily. Well, I love hearing your books as well as reading them. So this is about how the brain reacts to trauma. I've heard that grief, and particularly complex grief, is akin to a form of brain damage. Is that so?
I
wonder if they're thinking about brain fog. I wonder if they're thinking about brain fog. And yeah.
I mean, I think the shock of a death and the emotional turbulence that comes with grief, you do feel like you've been thrown onto this alien planet, that you don't know yourself, you kind of may not be able to think clearly. So it does feel like you've lost yourself that you knew before. But that, I mean, I think of brain damage as something like a hemorrhage or a stroke or something that has actually physically happened to your brain. Grief really often feels like fear. Trauma feels like terror. So anything that you can do that can regulate your system. I did the thing on the IG Live today about circuit breakers. So whether you do a breathing exercise or go for a walk or go outside, do things that soothe you, that will help bring down the level of fear in your body. And then when you have less fear in your body, your neofrontal cortex is available to think and to process and to kind of work out what's really going on and what do I need. Because when you're in fight, flight, or freeze, you don't think clearly at all. And also you're disconnected from your body. And even when people are moving towards you with warmth, when you're on high alert and vigilant, you don't feel the warmth. And so until you do physiological things to lower the gears in your physiological system, you won't be able to feel the support of other people, which is vital in the accommodating of your loss.
Thank you. This is a question about caring for a parent. I'm a carer for my mum who has bipolar disorder. She has become very needy and acts as though I should be there and thinking about her all the time. I'm 35 and I'm struggling to maintain boundaries around my time and aspects of my life. I've had counseling since I was 18. I don't know whether family therapy together might help us to share how we feel in a safe place. So kind of, would family therapy help for this?
I mean, in some ways, as what I find with the families that I saw, and I don't know whether your mother would be up for it, so she would have to be up for it. It means that the therapist can do a lot of the work for you. So I did all the facilitating so that you don't get stuck in the same kind of conversations and ways of being with each other. It shifts the dynamics. And so a therapist would be able to agree together what a boundary looks like, what that means, what your needs are, what her needs are, and that it comes from an underpinning love from each other, that boundaries are not an abandonment. It's not that you're kind of leaving her, but that she can trust that when you agree certain boundaries, it means that you'll be able to be more present when you're actually with her. So I would suggest seeing somebody with her. Whether she'll do that, I don't know.
We have a question about EMDR. When would you choose to use EMDR? So I keep scrambling them in therapy. Would you use this alongside other therapeutic approaches or as a standalone treatment?
So I think with grief, if that is your main thing, I would deal with the trauma first, because trauma gets in the way of the natural grieving process. So there's a place called an organization called the EMDR Associates that's online. Find an EMDR therapist, have your EMDR therapy, and then if there still are unresolved issues that are not trauma related, then I would do the therapy after that. Ideally, you'd find someone who you could do both with. So I'm EMDR trained, so I would do the trauma treatment first and then the therapy after.
Okay, this is about family breaking ties. My son died of an overdose. It's been horrible trying to keep going. My sister in Delaware didn't drive up for the funeral or support me. I thought it was cold, but decided to let it go. The same sister's son was married. I told her, this is a bit after, I was not able to attend emotionally, too distraught. At this point of time, I didn't want to speak with anybody or be seen. After the wedding, I reached out and asked how everything went. She was abrupt, and I continued to push until she sent me an email explaining she wasn't speaking to me or anyone else in my family who didn't attend the wedding. I find it so sad. Any thoughts or suggestions on healing? I know I have to let it go. It's very difficult. She never apologized and excused her behavior, saying she needed to come from a place of love.
I mean, what's incredibly sad is that everyone experiences loss in that situation. I mean, one of the kind of messages in my book is even when you're estranged from your family and you don't speak to them, their family are part of you. You only have to kind of eat a chicken curry that you had as a child and you're flown back in time around the kitchen table and all of you are there. So that they're in our bodies, they're in our genes, they're part of us. And I mean, it's a living loss for her that she has to grieve the loss of her sister. And that is like grief, with all the emotions of grief, the despair, the loss, the anger, the powerlessness. But if her sister puts up a blockade and isn't willing to build bridges or open communication, then you need to do the work of grieving your living sister. And I'm so sorry, given that what you've been through with your child dying, that is a massive additional loss that is extremely painful.
This is a question about young children witnessing raw adult grief from Lisa. I lost my son to suicide 2 years ago. Due to lockdown, my husband, my 2-year-old daughter, and I were locked down together. My 2-year-old witnessed very raw grief and continues to experience my difficulties in dealing with my son's death. I've lost my confidence as a good mom and always feel that my daughter deserves so much better. She's 4 now. Most of all, I'm so worried about the effects of her having to witness all of this. Should I be taking steps to get help for her in dealing with this before we start encountering the problems that I'm envisaging might lie ahead for her?
I'm so sorry. This is so painful, and I can hear, how traumatic this has been and how painful and how much you love your daughter. And obviously the death of your son by suicide is completely devastating. I mean, what we know from this research is that earlier the intervention, the better the outcome. So your daughter has, children learn their emotional selves by observing the adults around them. And it's really courageous of you to recognize that she has picked up your distress and that she is in some way displaying your distress. And so I would go to a child psychotherapist and see a therapist together to find ways of how you can manage with her and in front of her and without her, and how you can change the modeling that you do together between you, and how she can grieve as well. So, I mean, I think it's a really good idea.
I think the fact she's thinking about this now.
Instinctively, you know that it's what you need to do. Probably.
Exactly. And also that somehow that might give her a space also. She sounds extremely judgmental about herself and her own grief.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think therapy could also help her to be more compassionate to herself. Yeah. She's doing the best she can under really, really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, that's very good, Lisa. That's true.
We have a question about what's your view about the intergenerational trauma and losses that come from the practice of sending generations of young children to boarding school?
Well, in my first case study, Ivo Wynn went to boarding school, and he'd come from generations who'd gone to boarding school. And I think the loss, if you like, and there hasn't been that much research, there's been some books written, is that you learn to shut down your emotional vulnerability and expression of your emotions very, very young. And so that your capacity to trust your feelings, to express your feelings, to name your feelings. And of course, you know, as I said before, your emotions are transmitters of information so that you get your needs met. And what you do to block them are the things that do you harm over time, and often through generations. And so, you know, with Ivo, we did the work of him with his wife and his mum and his sister, and he did face his particular dilemma, but he didn't. There's a theory about the cost of feeling the pain of change and the outcome of the change that you want. And Ivo in particular, so he used alcohol to medicate his feelings, and he didn't think feeling his feelings was worth giving up the drink for. So, you know, that's a choice, but it, you know, it is painful to kind of really let yourself know what you're feeling. But the other side of it is that you don't have to do it all at once. You have a kind of window of tolerance. You can do little tiny bit at a time and incrementally adapt and grow and change. But, you know, that is very transgenerational, all those patterns with men. And they fought in wars, those men too.
I think that case study was really interesting too, because that was the case where he discovered that the man he thought to be his biological father was not his biological father. But thinking about storytelling, he'd grown up with a particular story of his life, but also felt the mismatch from his experience. He knew that there was something odd and strange. Yeah. And even though it was devastating learning this news about his father, it made sense of the experiences he had his whole life. And again, I think that was one of the areas where someone has a whole lifetime of experiences that don't match the family story. And recovering. And
that's where you go mad. That is crazy making.
Yeah. And recovering the secret actually makes you feel everything I've experienced makes sense and has a kind of rationality.
Coherent. There's pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that, you know, they can feel like holes in your heart, or they can feel like this ruminating questions that don't fit, or who am I, or what's wrong with me. And, you know, people protect us from the truth with good intentions. They want to protect the honor of the family. They don't want someone to suffer. They don't want to be covered in shame because this was an affair. So the reasons for secrets you can completely understand. But as much as I actually sometimes find facing the truth myself extremely difficult, and I will always turn away first. I'm like, no, I don't want this new thing. The truth, however hard it is better than a lie, because you can learn to live with the truth, and you can, as you say, you can have this authentic sense of yourself and the story that you've been told that finally is congruent and fits. And, you know, I think that's really important for mental health.
Definitely, definitely. We have so many more questions. We're not going to get to them all, but we'll try to get to a few more before the hour runs out. This is a question about opening up difficult conversations. My mother has clearly been impacted by traumatic events in her parents' life, and it's had a knock-on effect in her upbringing. This has had a negative impact on our relationship, but she's unwilling to talk about the past. Instead, she sticks her head in the sand and won't even consider that there's a possibility of change if she would open herself to different conversations. How do I start such conversations when all I've ever met with was denial and resistance?
I mean, you can only go so far with your mum as she will let you, sadly. I mean, I would go to, so don't ask direct questions. I would ask just small, curious questions, like tell me about what happened on your birthday. Tell me about your grandmother. Tell me about what was your favorite food when you were a child. So start with little unthreatening questions. You know, what did your dad do when he wasn't working? Did he have a hobby? You know, where was your grandparents' home? So in the back of the book, there are these, I think there are 14 questions that you can ask about your family, about where your parents met, or, you know, who proposed to who and where they come from. So you can ask unconfronting questions, if that's a word. And then you may find that your mum, because people like talking about themselves, they like telling their story. And through that, she may trust her own narrative and she may want to tell you more. But as a child of a mum who, she was dying and she was told that she had 3 months to live. And I asked her, she knows my job, this was 7 years ago. I said to her, what did the doctor tell you? And she said, that I've got flu. And I said, is there anything worrying you, Mum? She said, no, I'll be fine. And my kind of question for people is, do you have any worries? Because that's a very open question. And I use that with families, I use that with all sorts of things, because they can make it small, I'm worried the milkman isn't going to come, or they make it big, I'm worried I'm going to die. And my mum always made it as small as possible. And so even when she couldn't move and she was in her bed, she, you know, was in denial. And that, I had to respect that. That was all her life. She hadn't dealt with difficulty. She definitely hadn't dealt with death. And she was not going to start doing it age 90 when she was dying. And it wasn't for me to come in and march all over her defenses at that time.
And I said, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I guess what you're doing is giving people opportunities, but also recognizing the limits of our own power and not judging ourselves if we fail. We've tried.
But also,
you know.
just I mean, this may be not as interesting, but my mum had organised her funeral. It was in an envelope on the table at her desk. So she knew she was dying, and she said exactly what she wanted for her funeral. She even had cut out a picture of her coffin. She just couldn't talk about it.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, I feel like we could spend longer, but I want to get in one more question before we have to stop. Our 7-year-old daughter, this is quite a difficult one. Our 7-year-old daughter died very suddenly and unexpectedly in May. Our son was 5 at the time. It's been a traumatic time for us all, and we are doing fairly well considering. One of the things I've been so disappointed about is the fact that both sides of the family, our siblings, haven't been there for us. They have stepped out of our lives and our son's lives. They've been shockingly absent. I don't feel seen at all by my sister, and I don't know what to do about it. And there's a kind of related question again of a woman whose husband died. He took his own life. He died by suicide, and the sisters didn't come to the funeral. So again, there's a couple of these stories about, you know, really, really awful losses, deaths, and, you know, the family sort of walking away.
Yeah, that's so painful. I mean, there is a case study in my book about exactly that. And as a family system, I work with the grandmother, the parents of the child that had died, their stepson and their new daughter. And the thing that helped them, so the mother, she had to come to terms with she was never going to be able to be in relationship with her siblings. But the son, the grandmother, was very powerful, and she pulled the siblings together and kind of gave them a talking to. And I'm making it very short, but it was more complicated than that. But I wonder if your parents could help you with your siblings, is what I'm saying. It's because you are vulnerable. You know, it's such a recent loss. You're devastated. I wonder if your parents can influence your siblings to begin to see each other, and maybe just even go for a walk together to begin with, something that's unthreatening.
I think
collectively.
I think this.
Oh, she said all our parents are dead.
Yeah. So there's no support for that. So there's no way of doing that, which is a real shame.
I'm sorry about that.
And again, you sort of hit the limits of what you can do, and whether, I mean, the only other thing, it's not the same, but it's finding those people who are important to you.
Making your own family.
And also kind of maybe bringing in elements of the family, at least, you know, in conversation, but it's not the same, and it's really hurtful. We've had some other just comments, you know, one comment about how your story, Julia, about your mum resonates. My mother was exactly the same, and I respected her way of doing things. So I think that's a story that other people share experiences with.
Good.
And yes, and a few other notes, chats about people actually cutting off contact with parents. One woman whose dad was an alcoholic, and actually finding that quite helpful and liberating.
I think sometimes it is necessary. It's never for free. Again, there's a case study in my book of a man who's dying, who had to cut off his relationship with his mother and father, and he had no choice for his own mental health and his own survival. But he missed his mum because, however difficult, complex, and alcoholic one's parent is, that there's still the child in us that wants one's mum or dad, and so it's painful. But sometimes, in that risk-benefit measure, it is better to cut off, because you're not constantly looking towards them, wanting something, and always getting a bash instead. And so sometimes being estranged is the only option you have, but it's always painful.
I am afraid that I think we are out of time. We haven't, unfortunately, gotten to all the questions you've been asked, but I think you've covered a huge amount, as ever. And I hope that this gives listeners a sense of your wonderful book. Personally, I think it would make an amazing television show with, the therapist at the center and each of these stories. It reads, very vividly. And I think it's a compassionate, wise, and indeed gripping book. So, and brings together a lot of what you've said in the past, but in this much wider frame.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. And for those of you that buy it, there is a link, I think, here that you can buy it through the store. I hope it gives you, what I wanted is for people to understand themselves better, to give themselves insight, to kind of recognize their family dynamics, and give them ideas of what they might do to support themselves in their family. Because I do think the most personal is the most universal. And so that's what I hope, is that it's, people go, oh my God, well, that's a completely different family, but that is my mum.
I would think that you see things in the stories that resonate for you and your family, across different stories, things, yeah. I think. Yes, absolutely. So, well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you, Julia, for this tremendous conversation. And, and congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thanks. Thank you everyone who joined. I feel so fondly towards you all, and those painful stories that you shared about your losses. I am so sorry, and I hope you get the support that you need, because those really complex ones, I don't think you can manage them on your own. I think you do need support. So I hope you find it, and I hope you all have a good evening and take care of yourselves. And I send you all lots of love.
Yes. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.